The agents didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten anyone. They simply listened, asked questions, and took notes. Their professional tone alone was enough to show that this was no small issue. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bit of neighborhood drama. This was something real, something serious. Other neighbors stepped outside, pretending to water plants or check their cars just to watch what was happening. Normally, they ignored everything. Today, they couldn't look away. The street was filled with silence, broken only by the low voices of the agents, asking questions and the uneasy replies from the group. After speaking with the troublemakers, the agents walked to a few other homes to gather additional perspectives. Many neighbors who had stayed silent before now spoke freely, describing what they had seen over the past few weeks. Some even apologized to the agents for not speaking earlier. They admitted they were afraid of getting involved. Others said they had thought he could handle himself, but had never imagined what was actually happening behind the scenes. When the agents finished gathering information, they returned to his home. They explained that the investigation would continue formally and that the individuals involved would face consequences according to what the evidence supported. Some might receive official warnings. Others might face charges. It depended on the full review. He nodded, thanking them calmly. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking for dramatic punishment. He only wanted peace, respect, and the simple right to live without being targeted for no reason. Before leaving, one of the agents placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "You handled this better than most people would. You stayed calm when others wouldn't have." He appreciated the words, but didn't say much, just nodded with a small smile. When the agents drove away, the street remained strangely silent. The troublemaking group went inside their houses quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes. Other neighbors stayed outside for a moment, watching him, almost unsure whether to approach or leave him be. One older neighbor finally walked up to him and spoke in a kind voice. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "You didn't deserve any of it," simply nodded and said, "Thank you." He didn't give details. He didn't explain anything. He never talked about his work unless necessary. And now, with the situation being handled, he knew the best thing to do was return to his quiet routine. As the sun began to set, the neighborhood looked different. Not physically, but in the atmosphere. It felt calmer, more cautious, more respectful. People had finally seen what he had hoped they'd never need to see. They had seen that he wasn't helpless. They had seen that his silence wasn't weakness. They had seen that patience didn't mean fear. That night, he sat on his porch again, listening to the soft sound of crickets. The air felt lighter. The tension that had followed him for weeks was finally gone. He knew the investigation wasn't finished yet, but the hardest part was over. The truth had come out. The right people were handling things. And the troublemakers finally understood the consequences of pushing a quiet man too far. He leaned back in his chair, letting the cool evening breeze touch his face. He didn't smile widely, but there was a calm satisfaction in his eyes. He had handled everything with grace, patience, and discipline. And now, at last, the neighborhood was beginning to return to the peace he had wanted from the very beginning. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed deeply, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Tomorrow would be a quieter day, a better day, a day where he could finally live the way he intended, quietly, calmly, and without anyone trying to test the limits of his patience again. And this time, he knew the entire neighborhood would think twice before judging the quiet man who preferred to stay in the background. They had learned something important, something they would not forget anytime soon. The next morning came with a softness the neighborhood hadn't felt in a long time. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and even the usual noise seemed quieter than usual. He woke up earlier than normal, almost as if his mind knew the chapter that had been troubling him was finally coming to an end. When he stepped outside, he noticed something strange. People weren't hiding behind curtains anymore. They weren't whispering from a distance or pretending not to see him. This time, the neighbors simply watched him with gentle expressions, some embarrassed, some grateful, and some curious in a respectful way. He stood on his porch, taking in the scene. He felt calm, steady, and strangely relieved. After everything that had happened, After the quiet patience he had carried for weeks, the air around him finally felt clean again. He was about to walk back inside when he noticed someone approaching cautiously. It was one of the older neighbors, someone who had always kept to himself. He walked up slowly, almost nervously, holding a small plate of freshly baked bread. I thought you might like this, the older man said quietly. Not making direct eye contact, he gave a soft smile and accepted the gesture politely. Thank you. That's very kind. The older man nodded, cleared his throat, and added, I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier. I saw some of the things they did, and I should have said something. I really should have. He didn't want the man to feel guilty. So he spoke gently. It's all right. It's over now. The older man looked relieved, thanked him again, and walked away. He stood there for a moment, holding the warm plate, thinking about how different people behaved when fear turned into understanding. Before yesterday, no one would even make eye contact with him. But today, they were approaching him with kindness. Not because of his badge, but because they finally realized the truth. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't someone to be afraid of. He was simply a man who wanted to live quietly, just like anyone else. As the day went on, he saw more neighbors outside. Some waved awkwardly, some gave small smiles, and a few even started casual conversations with each other as if trying to rebuild the community spirit that had been missing for a long time. At noon, he went for a short walk around the neighborhood. The troublemaking group kept their distance. Their confidence had evaporated completely. They avoided his eyes, stayed inside their homes, and spoke in tones far quieter than usual. It wasn't fear in a harsh sense. It was more like a realization, sudden awareness that actions have consequences, even when the target stays silent. He didn't hold anger toward them. In truth, he felt a small sense of sadness. If they had simply minded their own business from the start, things would have been different. But now they had to live with the memory of being questioned by people who didn't accept excuses or games. On his walk, he passed a family he had seen many times before. They usually stayed distant, unsure of how to approach him. But today, the mother gave him a warm smile and said, "Good afternoon." He nodded kindly. "Good afternoon." Her young son waved shyly from behind her leg. He gave the kid a small nod too, which made the boy smile brightly. It was a simple moment, but it felt meaningful. People were finally seeing him as a person again, not a rumor, not a mystery, not a symbol of fear. When he returned home, he spent some time cleaning his small garden. The smell of the soil, the feel of the leaves, and the quietness around him helped wash away the leftover tension. It felt refreshing, almost healing. Later in the afternoon, he sat under the shade of the tree in his yard. The wind was gentle, brushing through the leaves, creating a soft whispering sound. He closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying the peace he had worked so hard to protect. His phone buzzed once. It was a message from the agency, not an urgent one, just a formal update. The investigation was moving forward. Some neighbors had received official notices. Others had been added to the follow-up list for further review. It was all by the book, just the way he preferred it. He replied with a short acknowledgement, then put the phone away. He didn't want to think about paperwork or reports. For the first time in weeks, he wanted to think about nothing. Just peace, quiet, stillness. As the sun started setting, the sky turned a warm orange. The soft light reflected off the houses, making the whole street look calmer than he had ever seen it. Birds flew across the sky, heading back to wherever they rested at night. It was a beautiful scene, simple, gentle, and filled with the silence he loved. A few minutes later he heard footsteps. Slow, hesitant ones. He looked up and saw one of the troublemakers approaching someone who had been loudest during the harassment. Today, he looked smaller, humble, nervous. The man stopped a few feet away and took a long breath before speaking. I wanted to say I'm sorry. There was no loudness in his voice. No sarcasm. Just genuine regret. He listened quietly. I shouldn't have judged you, the man continued. I shouldn't have joined the others. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know we'd gone too far. He paused again, waiting for some kind of reaction, but he simply nodded slightly. It's done now. I hope it won't happen again. The man nodded quickly, relieved by the simple response. "It won't, I promise." Then he turned and walked away, shoulders slumped, but lighter than before. Maybe the apology wasn't perfect, but it was real enough. That evening, something happened that changed everything. He was inside his house when he heard a soft knock on his side window. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. He froze for a moment, listening. Another knock came, followed by hushed voices. He moved silently through his house, careful not to cast a shadow in the wrong place. He peeked through a barely open curtain and saw two members of the group standing only a few inches from his window. They were trying to look inside again, just like before, but this time more boldly, more confidently, as if they believed they had the right. He watched them quietly, feeling a small shift inside his chest. Not anger, not fear. A decision. He stepped back from the window and went to his desk. He unlocked a small drawer and took out a simple, thin device, nothing extraordinary to look at, just a secure communication tool. He placed it on the table, ready but unused. He wasn't planning to call anyone yet. He just wanted it near him for now. He waited. The next day was the moment everything began to unravel for the group. He had left the house later than usual, around midday. The sun was high, the street was warmer, and more neighbors were outside. The group gathered near the corner, pretending to talk about something unrelated, but their eyes kept drifting toward him. He ignored them and walked to his car. But when he opened his car door, he saw something sitting on his front seat. A piece of paper. He reached in and picked it up. Someone had opened his car door trespassed, again, and left the note inside. The message said, "We'll find out the truth soon." He stared at the paper quietly. This wasn't harmless anymore. Someone had crossed the line very clearly. His car was locked. That meant someone used something to get inside. He didn't show a reaction, but inside, something tightened. He glanced around. The group was watching him from a distance. They seemed excited, almost proud. As he closed the car door, a man from the group walked toward him, not smiling this time. Instead, he looked almost triumphant. "We know you're not just some quiet guy," the man said. The quiet man looked at him calmly. "And what do you think I am?" The man smirked. "Someone hiding something." "Someone pretending to be normal," he didn't reply. Instead, he studied the man's face carefully, the way his eyes flickered with uncertainty underneath the confidence. The group didn't have any real information. They were guessing, building stories. But they believed their own guesses, and that made them reckless. Another person joined in, saying, "We're going to figure you out. It's only a matter of time." He nodded slowly. "Be careful what you look for." It blinked, not understanding. The moment grew tense. Silence stretched. Then someone who had been passing by, a woman not part of the group, caught sight of the quiet man's jacket shifting slightly as he moved his arm. She wasn't close, but she was close enough to see a glimpse of something black and metallic clipped inside the fabric. Not fully exposed, not intentional, just a small flash of something official. Her eyes widened slightly. She stepped back. The group didn't notice her reaction. She couldn't look away from the quiet man. Her breathing changed. Her posture stiffened. She whispered one single word under her breath. "Badge." The quiet man's eyes lifted slightly. He heard it. She knew she had seen more than she was supposed to. She looked at him with fear mixed with respect, not sure what she had discovered. But she didn't say anything more. She just turned and hurried away. Leaving the group confused, the quiet man knew what that meant. It had begun the truth slipping out in pieces. Not because he wanted it to, but because the group had pushed too far into a place they never should have touched. He could feel the shift coming. He could feel the moment approaching when silence would no longer protect anyone. He didn't want the neighbors to fear him. He didn't want attention. He didn't want rumors. But the spark had been lit. Someone had seen the badge, and whether the group knew it or not, everything in the neighborhood was about to turn upside down. The next morning started quietly, but the quietness felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of calm that comes before something big happens. He woke up early, made himself a cup of tea, and tried to focus on his morning routine. But his mind kept returning to what had happened the day before. He could feel that something had changed in the neighborhood. People were no longer whispering only out of curiosity. They were whispering out of fear. He stepped outside to get some fresh air. The sky was clear, the sun was soft, and for a moment it almost felt like any normal day. But it wasn't. He noticed two neighbors standing far across the street, talking in very low voices. As soon as they saw him, they quickly looked away and walked off. He didn't react. He simply walked to his porch and sat down, listening to the birds and the distant sound of a lawnmower. He knew what was coming. Once the truth about his real job started spreading, people would talk, panic, question, and assume. He had seen it happen many times before in other towns. People always had two reactions. Either they felt safer around him, or they suddenly felt uncomfortable. But this time, the situation was different. This wasn't just about curiosity. This time, the troublemakers in the neighborhood had crossed several lines. And now, they were scared of the consequences. He sat for a while, thinking about how much evidence he had collected. The videos, the audio recordings, the timestamps, they were all stored securely. Part of him had hoped it wouldn't come to this. He had wanted to live quietly, with no one paying attention to him. But the situation had grown past that. He finished his tea, stood up, and walked inside. After a moment of thought, he reached for his secure phone. It wasn't a device he used often, not unless things became serious. He stared at it for a few seconds, then finally pressed the button that opened a direct. Private communication line. A calm voice answered, "This is field operations. How can we assist?" He kept his tone steady and simple. "I need to report an ongoing situation. It involves harassment, trespassing, and attempted intimidation. I've collected full documentation." The person on the other end replied with the same calm professionalism. "Understood. Please send your file package. We'll review it immediately." He sent everything: weeks of recordings, notes, dates, and all the evidence he had quietly gathered while staying patient. When the upload finished, he felt a strange mix of relief and regret. He didn't like involving the agency in personal matters, but this wasn't just personal anymore. This was about safety, boundaries, and the law. A few minutes later, the voice returned. "Your documentation is clear. This meets the threshold for an official follow-up. Expect a visit today." He thanked them and ended the call. After that, he sat down at his kitchen table, tapping his fingers lightly on the surface. He wasn't nervous. He was simply thinking about how the neighbors would react when they saw official vehicles. Thinking about how the troublemakers would scramble, and thinking about how peacefully quiet the street might finally become after all this. Later in the afternoon, he stepped outside again, pretending to check his mailbox. He kept a relaxed expression, but he was observing everything. The troublemaking group was standing together near the corner, speaking anxiously. Their usual confidence was gone. They avoided looking at him directly, but he knew they were terrified. They weren't scared because he had spoken to them calmly. They weren't scared because he had asked them to stop. They were scared because now they knew he wasn't just some quiet man living alone. They knew he had reached a point where remaining silent was no longer the answer. Around 3 in the afternoon, 2 dark, unmarked cars slowly entered the neighborhood. They weren't loud. They didn't rush or draw unnecessary attention. They moved with the calm purpose of people who knew exactly what they were doing. He recognized the vehicles immediately, even before they parked near his driveway. A man and woman stepped out, both dressed in simple professional clothes. They didn't look aggressive or intimidating. They looked like people who were here to talk, to observe, and to handle things with order and respect. He walked toward them and greeted them politely. They responded the same way, shaking his hand and thanking him for his patience. They spoke calmly about the plan. They wanted to gather additional context from him, then speak with the individuals involved, one by one, without creating any chaos. He appreciated that. He always preferred things to be done quietly. After discussing the details inside his home, the agent stepped back outside and began moving down the street. They approached the group of neighbors with simple introductions and calm questions. But even from a distance, it was clear the troublemakers were shaking inside. Their voices were trembling. They struggled to explain their actions. Every sentence they spoke sounded like they were trying to shrink their own words, as if making the situation smaller would save them. Around noon, while he was trimming a few plants in his backyard, one of the group members approached his fence. She didn't look angry, just curious. But her curiosity had an impatient edge. "You always keep busy," she said with a strange smile. He didn't look up immediately. "It helps keep the mind clear." She nodded slowly. "You know, people are starting to wonder about you. You're very private." He finally looked up. "Is that a problem?" She paused, caught off guard by the simple question. "Well, not exactly. But it's unusual." "Unusual doesn't mean wrong," he said gently. She bit her lip, searching for something clever to say, but failing. Eventually, she shrugged and walked away. Though she kept glancing back at him as she went, as the week went on, strange things continued happening. Someone left a small, cheap camera on the side of his fence. It wasn't hidden very well, which meant it wasn't a professional attempt. When he found it, he picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. It wasn't even turned on. It was more like someone wanted to scare him into thinking he was being watched even, though he already knew he was. Another day, he found footprints in the mud near his side gate. They didn't match his shoes. Someone had walked around his property late at night. He didn't panic. He simply documented it, cleaned up the area, and strengthened the lock. But he knew this wasn't normal behavior from neighbors. It wasn't harmless curiosity anymore. It was obsession. One evening, he stood inside his home in the dark, looking through the blinds. He saw the group gathered near a corner house, talking in low voices. Their body language was tense, filled with nervous excitement. They looked like people planning something, not just gossiping. He watched them for a long minute, then stepped back into the shadows of his living room. He knew exactly what was happening now. This wasn't simple neighborhood drama. This was a group that wanted to believe they had discovered something big. And when people wanted to believe something badly enough, they often used their imagination instead of facts. He sat down and breathed slowly, reminding himself to stay patient. His goal was to remain unnoticed and unbothered. But the group wasn't going to let that happen. They were pushing, testing, poking, and sooner or later, they would push the wrong boundary. He didn't want the truth to come out this way. He didn't want anyone to know who he really was. But the farther they went, the closer they came to discovering a part of his life that wasn't meant to be seen by ordinary neighbors. He knew their behavior wouldn't stop on its own, and he knew the moment was approaching, the moment when their curiosity would collide with the truth they never expected. The moment when they would finally learn that the quiet man they pushed, watched, and judged wasn't helpless at all. He was FBI in the neighborhood. I had no idea how big of a mistake they were about to make. The quiet man noticed a change in the neighborhood the moment he stepped outside the next morning. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was something in the air, something in the way people glanced at him and then looked away too quickly. He had learned long ago to trust instincts that came from small details. Those instincts rarely failed him. Today, they told him that something had shifted overnight. The group that watched him before had grown bolder. Their confidence wasn't natural, it came from something they believed they had discovered. He didn't know what exactly, but he could feel it. People don't suddenly act like they hold a secret unless they think they have real information. And the group walked around with that kind of energy now. Like they were holding some invisible thread they wanted to pull on. He walked to his mailbox, as calmly as ever, and felt several pairs of eyes on him. Two people talking across the street stopped mid-sentence. One woman watering her plants looked at him, then quickly looked away when she realized he saw her. Another neighbor peeked from behind a curtain, not even pretending to hide her curiosity. He opened his mailbox and pulled out a few letters. Bills, advertisements, a small package he had been expecting. Nothing unusual. But when he closed the mailbox, he noticed something on top of it, a small smudge of dirt shaped like a fingerprint. Someone had touched his mailbox recently, be late at night or early in the morning. He brushed it off gently and walked back to his house. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it didn't feel random. The footprints near his gate, the strange notes, the odd questions, the small camera, someone tried to leave it all, added up to more than simple curiosity. Inside his home, he placed the letters on the counter and sat down at the table. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel scared. He felt something colder, something calmer, a steady kind of alertness that came from years of training. He had dealt with far more intense situations before, situations that required silence, patience, and smart choices. This neighborhood issue was small compared to those. His instincts treated every situation with equal seriousness. Later that afternoon, he went out to sweep the porch. It had become a kind of habit whenever he needed time to think without looking like he was thinking. As he swept, he heard soft footsteps approaching. He didn't look up right away. He finished sweeping one small corner before lifting his head. 3 members of the group were standing near his driveway, pretending to examine a small crack in the sidewalk. Their behavior was so forced that it would have been almost funny if it weren't so calculated. One of them straightened up and said, "Oh, hello. Didn't see you there?" He gave a small nod. "Afternoon." The group exchanged glances, each waiting for the others to speak. Then one finally stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We were just talking about neighborhood safety." "Ow," she began. "And we realize we don't really know anything about you." He leaned slightly on the broom. "I keep to myself. That's all." Her smile tightened. "Yes, we noticed." Another person folded his arms. People get nervous when someone acts secretive. He didn't respond right away. He studied their faces, a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and something else he couldn't quite place. Finally, he said quietly, "Everyone has their own way of living." "That's not enough," the man with the folded arms said. "We think you should be more open." He raised an eyebrow. "About what?" The man shrugged. "Where you go every day. What you do? Things like that." He looked at them calmly, not blinking. "Those are personal matters." That answer irritated them. They exchanged looks again, whispering under their breath. Then, without another word, they walked away, but not before glancing back at him 3 different times. Their eyes were sharp, hungry for something they weren't getting from him. When they were gone, he continued sweeping, but his thoughts were far from the porch. This wasn't normal neighbor curiosity anymore. This was pressure, intentional and growing. Later that night, while he was making tea in his kitchen, he heard quiet movement outside. He didn't rush to the window. Instead, he continued boiling the water, letting the sound guide his steps. When he finally looked through the curtain, he saw shadows moving near his front yard. 2 people stood close together, whispering, pointing at something on his porch. He couldn't hear what they said, but he could see their posture, the excitement, the nervousness. They seemed to be discussing something they believed they had discovered. He watched silently until they walked away, disappearing into the dim street. The next morning, when he stepped outside, he noticed something small but important. Someone had dropped a slip of paper near his door. He picked it up gently and unfolded it. The message said, "We know you're not who you say you are." He stood still for a moment, reading the words again. Not because he was shocked, but because he wanted to understand the mindset behind the note. The group didn't know anything real. They were guessing, building stories, filling in blanks that didn't exist. They didn't know he had an identity far more complicated than they could imagine. All they knew was their imagination. He folded the note, placed it in his pocket, and continued his morning routine. Later that day, as he walked down the street to take out the trash, he noticed several neighbors gathered again, whispering and glancing at him. Their faces carried something new, not just curiosity, but discomfort. People didn't like tension, and the group was creating plenty of it. They were stirring the entire street into worry as he walked back toward his house. A man who lived 2 houses away approached him slowly. He was not part of the group. He was someone who usually minded his business. His expression showed hesitation, but also genuine concern. "Hey," the man said quietly. "Can I ask you something?" The quiet man nodded politely. "Of course." The man looked around, making sure the group wasn't nearby. I don't know what those people are doing. They're saying a lot of strange things about you. None of it makes sense to me, but they're convincing some folks." He appreciated the honesty. "People believe rumors easily," he said. The man nodded. "I just wanted you to know. Some of us don't care about any of that. We just want peace." "I want the same," the quiet man said. The man gave a small nod and walked away. Relieved to have said his part, the quiet man watched him go with a thoughtful expression. If someone who wasn't involved was feeling uneasy, then the group was spreading their ideas more widely than he expected. He looked at them calmly. "Privacy isn't a crime." They stepped closer. "Well," one said, "maybe we'll just start watching a little more closely." He held their stare without blinking. "You can watch whatever you want. Just don't trespass." The confidence in his voice surprised them. They weren't used to someone speaking so calmly under pressure. They turned and walked away with stiff posture. Pretending they hadn't been unsettled by his tone, he watched them go, then unlocked his door and stepped inside. Once the door closed behind him, he let out a long breath. Not of fear, but of frustration. He knew this was only the beginning. People like them didn't stop until something forced them to, and quietly, inside his well-ordered home. He returned to the life no one on the street knew existed, the one filled with encrypted messages, secured files, and a badge locked away in a drawer. A badge that held 3 letters powerful enough to change the entire neighborhood's view of him, FBI. He didn't want to use that identity here. He hoped he wouldn't need to. But as the days passed and the neighbors grew bolder, he sensed that the truth would reveal itself sooner than anyone expected, and when it did, everything on that quiet street would change. The tension in the neighborhood grew slowly, like a small fire under dry wood. At first, it wasn't obvious. It showed up in tiny ways: a cold stare from across the street, a whisper behind a half-closed window, a door that closed just a little too fast when he walked by. The quiet man noticed all of it, though he never reacted. He had been trained to observe the smallest things without letting anyone see what he was thinking. Still, he could feel the shift. The group that watched him before was now more than just curious. They were irritated, restless, and far too interested in his daily life. He continued living as calmly as before. He woke up early, jogged while the sun was still faint and the sky still quiet. Then made breakfast with the same routine each morning. He kept his house clean, answered necessary emails, and stayed focused on the tasks only he knew about. The world outside saw only a quiet man who didn't like attention. But inside his home, he handled work that required careful thinking and strong discipline work. The neighbors could never imagine, even with his calm life. It became harder to ignore the little interruptions the group created. They began walking past his house more often, slowing down to look at his windows, his curtains, his yard. They pretended to check their phones or tie their shoelaces right near his driveway. They didn't say anything to him directly. Their presence lingered like an unspoken challenge. One morning, after returning from his run, he noticed someone had placed a small note on his porch. It wasn't threatening, but it was clearly meant to unsettle him. The note said, "People are wondering who you really are." The handwriting was oddly neat, as if someone had taken their time to look serious. He looked at it for a few seconds, then folded it and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He didn't plan to throw it away. He saved everything, even the smallest things. Knowing that small things sometimes became important later. Later that afternoon, while sweeping his front walkway, he saw 2 of the group members across the street, pretending to water plants that didn't need watering. They kept glancing at him when they thought he wasn't looking. Their stares didn't bother him, but he understood what they were trying to do. They wanted him to feel watched. They wanted him to react. Instead, he kept sweeping calmly. Their whispers traveled through the quiet air. "He's hiding something," one of them murmured. "Nobody stays that quiet for that long unless they're up to something." He didn't comment, didn't change his expression. Didn't he reveal a single thought? He simply continued his slow, steady movements, as if the broom in his hand was the only thing that mattered in that moment. Later that day, he left the house briefly to pick up some groceries. When he returned, he caught sight of one of the group members standing at the corner of his property line, pretending to look at her phone while clearly watching his driveway. He nodded politely as he walked past her. She didn't smile back. She simply stared, almost as if waiting for him to reveal something. Inside the house. He placed the groceries on the counter, then walked over to the window to check if she was still there. She had moved on, but two others were now standing a few houses away, talking and glancing toward his street. He sighed softly. None of this was dangerous yet. But he knew how patterns worked. People who let curiosity turn into obsession often crossed lines without realizing it. He made tea and sat near the back window, where the view was more peaceful. Birds hopped along the fence, and the sunlight filtered gently through the branches of a tall tree. Moments like these helped him stay calm. He didn't want the frustration he felt to grow into something heavy. He knew better than to let small annoyances cloud his judgment. Still, he mentally noted the shift in the neighborhood's behavior. He didn't want trouble, but he could sense that trouble was moving in his direction whether he wanted it or not. That evening, as he took out the trash, he saw three members of the group walking together on the sidewalk. They weren't talking like they usually did. Instead, they were looking around secretly, as if scouting something. When they saw him, they paused. One of them smirked. "Busy night?" she asked, her voice too sharp to be friendly. "Just cleaning up a bit," he replied. "You're always cleaning," she said. "Always doing something alone." "Some people enjoy quiet," he answered simply. The three exchanged glances and laughed. Not because something was funny, but because they wanted him to feel uncomfortable. He kept his posture relaxed, though inside he measured every detail the direction they faced. The tone of their voices, the tension in their shoulders. Old instincts from his training always stayed alert before they walked away. One of them looked at him and said, "A neighborhood only stays safe when people are open. You should remember that." He nodded lightly. Safety is important. They didn't understand what he meant. They walked away, whispering, probably convinced they had intimidated him. But he wasn't intimidated. He was simply patient. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was more powerful than confrontation. The next day, while he was sitting at his desk working on an encrypted document, he heard soft footsteps near his living room window. They were too close to be someone passing by normally. He stood quietly, walked to the window without letting his shadow show, and peeked through a tiny gap in the curtain. One of the group members was standing right up against his front garden, pretending to admire a plant that wasn't even growing. She kept leaning slightly to the side, trying to look through the window without appearing suspicious. He stayed still, watching her for several seconds. Then he stepped back, deciding not to confront her. Confrontation would only feed her curiosity instead. He walked to the back of the house, opened his notebook, and wrote down the time, the date, and the description of what he saw. He kept all these notes organized, even though he hoped he would never need them. That night, he heard two of them talking outside his house. Their voices were low, but the quiet street carried sound easily. One said, "We just need to figure out what he's hiding." The other replied, "We will. People like him always mess up eventually." He didn't move from where he sat. He kept reading a book, pretending nothing was happening outside. But mentally, he knew this was going somewhere uncomfortable. The group wasn't satisfied with rumors anymore. They wanted proof for something that didn't exist. The following morning, he stepped outside to get the mail and saw a few neighbors standing in a small cluster nearby. They fell silent the moment they saw him. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and awkward guilt. He nodded politely at them. Only two gave him a quick nod back. The rest simply stared or looked away. He could tell the group had been talking. They were spreading their ideas around, trying to convince everyone that he was a mystery worth solving. Most people probably didn't care, but the group had a way of making small worries seem bigger. He wasn't upset about it, just aware. After picking up his mail, he went inside and sat at the table. He opened an envelope that contained nothing interesting, then set it aside. But while sorting through the rest, he found something strange. A folded paper without a stamp or name. Someone had put it directly into his mailbox. He opened it carefully. The message inside said, "You can't ignore us forever." It wasn't threatening enough for police involvement, but it wasn't harmless either. It showed intention. It showed that someone had crossed from watching to wanting a reaction. He put the note aside, added it to his file of observations, and sat quietly for a long moment. He didn't want this to escalate. He wanted to be a neighbor, not a subject of suspicion. But he knew how people behaved when they built stories in their heads. They didn't stop until something forced them to reconsider. Most people in the neighborhood barely noticed him when he first moved into the small brick house at the end of the street. The house itself was nothing special. It was clean, quiet, and always kept in perfect order. The man who lived there seemed to match the house. He moved around calmly, spoke softly when someone greeted him, and kept to himself. He wasn't rude. He just didn't talk much. If someone waved, he waved back. If someone asked how he was doing, he answered with a polite smile and a short reply. Then he would return to his quiet routines, giving the impression of someone who was simply content to stay in the background. The neighbors made their own guesses about him, the way people often do when they don't have enough information. Some thought he'd worked from home. Others believed he had no job at all. A few said he probably didn't like people. Only a couple of older folks said he seemed kind, just private. But the majority barely gave him a second thought, except for a certain group on the street who enjoyed paying far too much attention to everyone else's business. This group was known by everyone, even though most avoided them. They weren't dangerous, but they were the type who acted like they ran the entire neighborhood. They watched people through their windows, whispered about everyone's routines, and made small problems feel big. They complained about lawns being slightly too long, cars parking just a little outside the lines, or trash cans being out an extra hour. They claimed to protect the community, but in reality, they just liked control. And the new quiet neighbor quickly became their favorite subject. The group didn't like that he stayed to himself. They wanted everyone to act the way they expected. They liked neighbors who talked, who joined their little gatherings, and who followed all their unspoken rules. So when this quiet man didn't fit into their idea of what a neighbor should be, they took it as a personal offense. At first, their comments were small and passive. One of them would walk by his house and say loudly to another, "People nowadays don't even try to get to know anyone." Another would shake their head dramatically as they passed him, pretending he couldn't hear. Sometimes they would stand a little too close to his mailbox or car, as if inspecting things they had no business looking at. He saw it all. He noticed their stares, their little comments, the way they seemed to track his movements. But he didn't react. He simply continued his routine, the same calm and steady way he always did. He woke up early, took a quiet jog before sunrise, made his morning coffee, and left the house for a few hours during the day. Some days he returned earlier, some days later. His routine was simple, but to this group, it became a mystery they wanted to solve. They didn't understand why a man with no visible job left his home at unpredictable times. They didn't understand why he didn't talk about his background or where he came from. They didn't understand why he never invited anyone inside. And instead of minding their business, they convinced themselves that something must be wrong with him. One morning, while he was sweeping his porch, two of the group members walked over pretending to be friendly. He looked up and nodded politely, not expecting anything more than a simple greeting. But instead of waving and walking away, they stood in front of him with forced smiles. So one of them said, dragging out the word, "We haven't really seen you around much." He calmly replied, "I've been settling in, just trying to keep things simple." They both laughed awkwardly, trying to make the moment feel casual. "Well, around here, we like to get to know our neighbors. Keep an eye out for each other." He smiled lightly. "That's nice." Then he continued sweeping. The two exchanged looks, not pleased with how little information he was offering. They wanted to dig deeper, but he wasn't opening any doors for them, literally or figuratively. After another minute of strained small talk, they left with irritated expressions, whispering to each other the moment they were far enough. After that day, their attitude shifted. They became less friendly and more judgmental. They told anyone who would listen that the quiet neighbor was strange. They made comments about how he never shared anything about himself. They wondered out loud why he didn't have any family visiting him. They didn't know it, But the quiet man heard most of these things. He simply chose not to react. What they didn't know was that he wasn't bothered by their gossip. He had heard worse. He had seen worse. And the truth was, he had far more important things to worry about than a few bored neighbors. His life was built around staying unnoticed. That wasn't a personal preference. It was a professional requirement. The less attention he drew, the better. It kept him safe. It kept others safe. It kept his work in the shadows where it needed to be. But the group took his silence as weakness. They assumed he was someone who could be pushed, intimidated, or controlled. They mistook calmness for helplessness, something he had seen happen many times before in other places. Other situations far more serious than this neighborhood. Whenever people underestimated him, he quietly observed. He let them think whatever they wanted until the time came when the truth revealed itself naturally. He didn't want any problems with the neighbors. He didn't want to stand out or make enemies. But he also wasn't going to let anyone invade his privacy or disrespect his boundaries. He kept his guard up, even in the quietest moments. It was second nature to him, something he had practiced for years. A few days later, while he was unloading groceries from his car, another member of the group approached him. This one was more confrontational than the others. He didn't bother with small talk or forced smiles. He simply walked up, crossed his arms, and looked the quiet man up and down. "You don't say much, do you?" The quiet man paused, holding a grocery bag in his hands, then looked at him calmly. "Not unless there's something important to say." The man scoffed. "People around here want to know who's living next to them. You can't just move in and act like you're invisible." He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he set the grocery bag on the ground gently, stood straight, and looked at the man with steady eyes. "I'm not trying to be invisible. I'm just living my life quietly." The other man rolled his eyes. "Well, quiet doesn't work here." The quiet man nodded politely, picked up his grocery bag, and simply said, "Have a good day." Then he walked inside. That simple, peaceful exit made the man angry. He had expected a reaction, an argument, an apology, something he could use to make himself feel powerful. But he got nothing, and that only fueled the group's obsession. Over the next few weeks, they paid even more attention to him. They made comments when he walked by. They peered through their blinds when he left the house. They whispered loudly enough for him to hear. They even started rumors that he was hiding something illegal. None of it was true. But they weren't after truth. They were after control. One evening, he sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun lower behind the houses. It was one of the few moments where he allowed himself to fully relax. The neighborhood was quiet at that time. The warm air carried the sound of distant laughter from children playing a street over. He liked moments like these. They reminded him that normal life still existed, even though his own life was anything but normal behind the scenes. As he was sitting there, one of the group members walked by with a forced smile. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" she said. "It is," he replied kindly. She paused, then leaned slightly forward. "You know, people talk. They wonder why you keep to yourself so much." He took a slow sip of his tea. "Everyone has their own way of living." She nodded quickly, pretending to agree, but her eyes held the same curiosity as always. "Well, we just want to make sure everything is normal," he smiled softly. "I understand," but she didn't leave. She stayed there awkwardly for a moment, waiting for him to say something more. When he didn't, her smile faded, and she walked off with a confused expression. Inside, he sighed quietly. He didn't want any attention. He didn't want questions or curiosity. He simply wanted to blend in. But he could feel the pressure building around him, slowly but steadily. He knew their behavior might eventually cross a line. People like them didn't know how to stop once they decided someone was different. Still, he stayed calm. He didn't let their behavior change his tone or routine. He kept his house tidy, his schedule quiet, and his presence minimal. He continued jogging early in the morning when most people were still asleep. He left the house at hours that didn't overlap with their routines. In many ways, he structured his life to avoid them. But avoidance wasn't going to keep them away forever. Late one afternoon, As he returned home from running errands, he noticed two of the group members standing unusually close to his driveway. They weren't talking or pretending to pass by. They were waiting for him. He parked slowly, stepped out of the car, braced himself mentally for whatever was coming next. One of them crossed their arms. "We had a meeting today," she began, her tone smug. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what?" "About you," the other said. "We think you're hiding something, and we don't like secrets on this street." Didn't react. He didn't frown, didn't show irritation. He simply placed his keys in his pocket and said, "I'm not hiding anything. I just keep my life private." They both laughed as if he had told a joke. "People who keep their life private usually have something to hide," one of them said.